Atari Anonymous. My son Boris has a missile command problem.
My mission in life is to save all of mankind.
Lately, my daughter has developed a similar problem with Atari warlords. You Atari Anonymous, is this problem contagious?
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Player One Start. So yes, this is the last episode of No Shave November for me this year. Even though it's coming out a week later, I filmed this just at the end of November. And even though I think the beard has turned out pretty well, I am going to have to shave it off. So this is the last episode this year of me with the beard. But that said, diving right into today's video topic, I'm actually doing this video as a follow-up to my 10 essential games for the Atari 2600. In this video, I'm going to address a few of the comments that I've gotten in that video, especially from people who were upset that I didn't include certain games for that system. Before diving into the continuation of this list, I am going to emphasize that this list is not really ranked, it's just 10 games that I selected almost at random that I happen to enjoy and think that people should own for their Atari 2600. So don't think that because a certain game is mentioned before another game on this list that I like that game better. I like all of these games almost equally, and I feel that this kind of list should not be ranked for those that are just trying to collect games for the 2600 and have a good enjoyable experience with it. That also means if I have omitted a game from this list, it's not because I think that that game shouldn't be ranked in the top 10 or now the top 20 games on that console. You know, I kind of set the limitation of only reviewing 10 games at a time, so just because it didn't make my first list or this one, doesn't mean if I were to do a part 3 that it wouldn't make the list then either. Also keep in mind that on the 2600 especially, there are a lot of games designed specifically for a two-player experience. Well, as you can guess from my channel, I'm just a single person doing all of this stuff. It's called Player One Start. So unfortunately, if a game is specifically two-player and doesn't have AI, which a lot of Atari 2600 games were not designed with that, unfortunately it's not going to make the list at this time. As for the other criteria I used for this list, be sure to check out part 1 where I explain the criteria I used to choose games for this list. That said, let's go ahead and dive right in and see 10 more games I think are essential for those that own an Atari 2600. Atlantis is a fixed shooter video game released by Imagk, or Imagk, in July of 1982 for the Atari 2600. The player controls the last defenses of the city of Atlantis against the Gorgon invaders. The city has 7 bases which are vulnerable to attack. 3 of these have firepower capabilities to destroy the Gorgon ships before they manage to fire death rays at one of the settlements. According to the creator, this game sold over 2 million copies, making it Imagk's second highest selling game of all time. My take on this game is that, as simplistic as the game is, it's incredibly addicting. Trying to take down the ships with one of 3 guns that you really can't aim, you just have to choose when to fire, I think will appeal to gamers that like games like Missile Command, or even some of the more modern games today where you're speedrunning through a level. Kaboom is another game from Activision that I would recommend for the Atari 2600 because of its addictive qualities as well. The game itself is an unauthorized adaptation of the 1978 Atari coin-op game Avalanche. Again, another game you can spend hours trying to get good at on this console. This game also won an award for Best Audio and Video Effects. Gosh, let's just all take a minute to admire the Nintendo and Atari logos on one copyright screen. This game was the world's introduction to Mario and his brother Luigi starring in their own arcade game back in 1983. Even though the character started out in Donkey Kong, he didn't get the name Mario until this game. Again, knowing the limitations of the Atari 2600 really makes this game a lot more impressive than it looks. But what really cinched it as an essential game for me was the gameplay. This game controls surprisingly well, and the sound effects aren't too bad either. Overall, an enjoyable experience on the Atari 2600, and I would definitely recommend it if you're a fan of Mario games and Atari. This is the game I got the most comments about not having on my first 10 essential games list. And it's very easy to see why. I mean, it's a vertically scrolling shooter performing on the Atari 2600. Not only is this graphically impressive, but it brings a genre of games that I'm very fond of, to a console I didn't think would be able to handle. This game just barely did not make the cut of the first 10 games. I vowed that if I ever made a continuation of this list, I would have to include it, so here it is. In this game, you can only move your jet left and right, as well as speed up or slow down. But other than that, your goal is to take out enemies while collecting fuel and not getting hit in order to keep advancing. Destroying a bridge serves as the game's checkpoints. If the player crashes the plane, their jet will start next to the last destroyed bridge. But other than that, just like most other games at the time, your goal is just to get a high score. And even though this game is available on other platforms, I still find myself being most nostalgic about the Atari 2600 version, and I would definitely recommend it as an essential for your collection. Another game frequently mentioned that I should have on my essential games list is the game Space Invaders. The Atari 2600 was the first home game console to get an officially licensed port of this game, and it became the first killer app for this system, almost quadrupling the system's sales. This game also sent Atari off in the direction that would make it the most successful, licensing or creating home ports of arcade games. But that success also showed how incapable the Atari 2600 was in creating faithful ports of most of the arcade games that were out at the time, running on far superior hardware. But in the case of Space Invaders, this is a pretty faithful port, and I would definitely recommend it as an essential game for your Atari 2600. Breakout was an arcade game developed and published by Atari, released in 1976. It was conceptualized by Nolan Bushnell to be a single-player version of Pong. It was eventually built by Steve Wozniak with the aid of Steve Jobs, who was officially employed by Atari at the time. This game is fun and addicting, however, it does require that you use the Atari paddle controllers rather than the joystick. At least from my experience, you'll have a lot better time playing it with the paddle controllers. Berzerk is yet another game that was frequently mentioned as being an essential game that I should include on my list, and I agree with that to a certain extent. While personally not one of my favorite games on the system, I can acknowledge the impact this game had on the system itself and its place in video game history. The player must make their way through a series of top-down maze-style-like rooms containing armed robots. The player has an attack, but also must avoid attacks by the armed robots. To quicken the pace of the game, an enemy named Evil Otto, represented by a smiley face, will, after a certain amount of time, enter the room and force the player to exit. An interesting item of note is that this version on the Atari 2600 has a mode that allows the player to kill Evil Otto, but he will return after a certain amount of time. Overall, this is a faithful port of the arcade version of this game, albeit with lesser graphics and sound. As a result of Star Wars maintaining its popularity since the late 70s, early 80s, I would definitely recommend trying out some of the early Star Wars games released for the Atari 2600. While overall I don't find these games too particularly remarkable in terms of gameplay, the nostalgia for Star Wars will really make this game worth it for you if you're a Star Wars fan. If I had to narrow down the list, I would say that Death Star Battle and The Empire Strikes Back are two games that you should pick up for this console if you're a Star Wars fan and you have the Atari 2600. If you're interested, I've already done a video review of all of the Star Wars games that were released for the Atari 2600, including one that was a demo prototype found years later. And here we have probably the number one game that I keep getting told that should have been on my previous list. Missile Command is a classic shooter game that is iconic today in terms of its stance in video game history. Basically, the goal of this game is to keep the missiles from striking your bases or cities down on the ground. You do this by firing off missiles and then having them detonate near the projectiles heading towards the ground. Doing so will destroy the missile. Failure to do so will result in a loss of a city or possibly one of your missile launchers. This game is a prime example of the classic Atari gameplay of easy to pick up, but difficult to master. This port on the Atari 2600 does push the hardware to its maximum limits. As you can tell, that some of the missiles are often falling in the same direction and flickering so that they can show as many missiles as they can on screen. Overall, not a bad port though, and I would definitely recommend it as an essential game for your Atari 2600. So there you have it. There are 10 more games I feel are essential to own for the Atari 2600. I really want to thank you all for your comments and feedback on the first episode in this series, and I look forward to viewing your comments about what did I miss this time and what should I do in the future. I am going to note that if I do continue this series, I'm most likely going to move on to another console before coming back to the Atari 2600. So if you have any suggestions on which console I should do next, and on what games I should include for that console, please leave a comment below. I'd really like to see what your take is on it. That said, again, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Remember, if you like what you see, please hit that like and subscribe button, share with a friend. I'll see you all next time. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Also, if you enjoy the content of this channel, please remember to click on this subscribe button. Again, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.